Hello and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about a feature in Lightroom called profiles. And this basically tells Lightroom how it needs to interpret your raw file. If you shoot JPEG, this doesn't apply to you because your camera does this for you automatically, and once the camera sets it in a JPEG, it just is what it is. But with raw files, we do have the option to go and do a bunch of different interpretations of that raw file to get the kind of look that we want to achieve. This can be a vintage look, it could be something similar to one of the camera profiles, or it could be one of Adobe's own interpretations as well. So how do we go about actually applying a profile? And this is something that Adobe recommends, and I agree with completely. This is one of the very first things that you should do with any photo that you come in. Now, they make it easy to miss where you go and do this. So when we look right at the top of the basic panel in the develop module, we'll see a very small area called profile, and the default is Adobe Color. And there's a little grid next to it. That's actually where we go to do that. But if we look at the drop down, we see it only shows us a small number of options. These options are actually related to ones that we have designated as favorites. If you haven't designated any as favorites, then the Adobe ones themselves will be the ones that are automatically selected as your favorites, whether you like it or not. The better way to go in and use this is to actually click on these four rectangles. When we do that, it actually opens up a new panel. And this panel shows all kinds of different options. At the top, we have the Adobe Raw options. So these are lookup tables that Adobe has come up with, and that's what these are all based up, is something called a lookup table, of how to interpret the raw data from your camera for that particular image. And they give you choices of color, landscape, neutral, portrait, standard. Very similar actually to what you would see with your camera. But in my opinion, there's better options. And in fact, rarely, if ever, do I make use of the Adobe ones. Instead, if I scroll down, I find ones that are called camera matching. And this is going to be very dependent upon the camera that you used to take the photo. So in this case, this photo was taken with a Nikon Z7 II, and this is showing the same options that I would have if I was creating JPEGs in my Z7 II. So all of these are things that I can select in camera. Now, one word of caution here is that these are not exactly the same interpretation that Nikon does in camera. This is Adobe's best guess or best approximation as to what that interpretation should be. This is something camera manufacturers typically do not share with third parties, and so companies like Adobe just have to do their best guess. But it is pretty close, and actually I find them pretty usable. So my approach to applying profiles is I generally start by selecting camera matching standard. And we do this by just clicking on the profile that we're interested in. I can then go and hover over one of the other profiles and see how that looks compared to camera standard. So that's why I start with camera standard. This allows me to go and do some comparisons as I look at the other profiles. And so when we see landscape, we see it looks a little bit different. And if I just move the cursor off, it'll go back to showing standard. So a little like being at the eye doctor, which is better, this or that. And you can kind of determine, if I find that there's one that I like better, then what I'll do is I'll simply select that. Now there's something that I haven't talked about, and that is, in addition to the Adobe general ones and camera matching, there's also a whole bunch of others. And in fact, we can add, or you can add, third-party ones. This is a free sample pack that I received a long time ago. There's also ones that Adobe gives you that are artistic, and you can see they've got some kind of unusual things, although I do sometimes use Artistic 5. A whole lot of black and white ones. There's also some modern ones, and modern 5 and 7 I find sometimes work pretty nice as well. And in fact, looking at that, modern 7 actually isn't too bad. I kind of like what it's doing in the background, but I think I'll stick with what I currently have selected. And then there's also some vintage ones. And these vintage ones can also be rather interesting as well. And I do like Vintage 4. This gives you a little bit of that old film kind of look. So really a nice emulation of that. So once you have the one that you like, then you can close the profile browser, and you do that by selecting close, and it will just bring you back to the edit or the rest of the editing panels. So you can go and do the rest of the work to it. So a couple of other things to just kind of be aware of. So you'll notice with camera landscape selected, there's this amount slider up here that is grayed out. When we go and select some of the other options that Adobe gives us, such as I mentioned, Vintage 5 is one that sometimes I just kind of like the look, or Vintage 4. You'll notice now that slider has become active, and that's because with these particular profiles, Adobe does give you the option as to how much of that you want to apply. And so I can take that and I can basically move it one way or the other. And then you can always just double click on the word if you want to go back to 0. Another thing that I mentioned at the very beginning was about that drop-down list and how you can save yourself a little bit of time. And notice Vintage 4 has this little star selected. What that means is I've designated this as a favorite. Anything I've designated as a favorite is going to show up in that drop-down list. And to do that, you simply go to one of these, just click on that little star, and once you do that, it's now part of favorites. You can also see that by scrolling all the way back up to the top and having them identified up here. Now, I always prefer to work in this mode as opposed to the drop-down, simply because this gives me that option to do that hover that I showed. If I just select from the drop-down, it's just going to go there and it's just going to be what it is. Obviously I can click on the other ones, but I like to have that quick comparison of being able to just move from one to the other to see what it is that I'm looking at. So in this case, Landscape 5 is where I'm at. I mentioned Modern 7. I thought it looked pretty good, and you can see just going back and forth the difference that it makes. And so just kind of a couple of extra things that you could do with it. So once you're finished, all you do is select close, and now you begin your edits. And so the important thing to remember is that this is just your starting point. Once you've applied the profile, then you can start working with everything else. I do find it important to do this first because things like white balance and that can sometimes look a little bit different the way it gets applied based upon the profile that you had. Now in this case, this was taken middle of the day, pretty sunny. And so if I select daylight, I can see that, that's going to improve things quite a bit too. And now I can go through and do the rest of my edits. So where did this image end up? Well, here it is. I did a little bit of cropping, adjusted a number of the basic sliders, did a little bit of sharpening on it, but really didn't do a whole lot more to this. I did select the Jeep itself using a mask, and I did brighten it up just a little bit, especially brought up the shadows in order to see some of the details underneath the Jeep and to bring down some of those brighter spots. But overall, didn't have to really do too much once I had the right profile selected. So hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give it a like. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe, and you'll be notified when new videos become available. Thanks.